co-founder and CEO of SureCloud. So thanks for joining us for this webinar. Excited to be joined by Michael Rasmussen, who I'm sure needs no real introduction, but the GRC pundit. We've been working with Michael for well over 10 years now and really enjoy all of our interactions and his insights into GRC and wider business. He's going to be covering measuring the value of GRC technology today, which is something that I think is really, really important, even based on the changes that we've seen in the markets over the years. So certainly, as we've seen the market really rapidly grow post-COVID, there's been a much broader adoption of GRC technology, which is coming down the sort of, I guess, the organizational size and maturity levels into a much more mainstream market. In fact, G2's momentum report, or most recent momentum report, placed GRC as the second fastest growing product category behind AI, which is incredible to think from where we started in this product category. It's still really important, though, for organizations to build really robust business cases, and it's something that we help our prospects with through our sales process. And it's really interesting in terms of our approach that we have and how it interacts and links with Michael's approach that he's going to talk us through today. I think the two key things that we really try and help with is to make sure that any organization looking to invest in GRC technology, the people that we're talking to, which is typically within the sort of CISO function, is looking much broader than just inside its function itself. So making sure that it's not a blinkered view of the value that GRC can deliver to businesses. The reality is that GRC has a much broader value across the whole of an organization, and it certainly takes everyone in a company, an organization, to actually participate and deliver the true value that GRC can bring to the table. The other piece that we try and make sure is that there is a thread that links back to strategic objectives that the organization is looking to achieve. And certainly, trying to elevate GRC into the boardroom, it's really important that you do hook onto any of those objectives that you can. Certainly, cyber is definitely a board topic in every organization that we work with. But if there are initiatives around compliance, regulation, etc., then as many threads back into the higher level board objectives, the better, ultimately. It's really important that one of the areas that a lot of our organizations that we talk to initially also concentrate on is the post-proof points. So building a business case is great, obviously, to justify the investment. They tend to be based on metrics and value that will be delivered back to the organization. But then it's really then trying to actually follow through to then have the KPIs and metrics built into the offering to then demonstrate that that value has actually been delivered. And it's something that sometimes is missing from the perspective of some of the prospects that we work with. Our brand promise as a company is your business assured, which ultimately encompasses trust, resilience, and continuous monitoring. But to deliver on that, we obviously have to make sure that the value in GRC technology is completely understood. And this is where I'm going to hand over to Michael. As I've mentioned, there will be a Q&A at the end of this session, and I'll ask questions. So please do contribute to the session. Any questions that you have of Michael or myself, then please submit them, and I'll go through those questions at the end. But at this point, I'll hand over to Michael.
Thank you, Nick, and it's a pleasure working with you again on a webinar and helping companies, direct and develop their GRC strategies and build those business cases. Now, in that context, another title slide here for you, but I'm Michael Rasmussen. I describe my job as research. I research what are the challenges companies like yours face in the context of governance, risk management, and compliance, and how do they go about solving those challenges with strategy, process, and technology. I've got 33 years total experience, but 25 as an analyst, spent 7 years at Forrester Research as their top analyst. And my claim to fame is I defined a model to market in February 2002 and labeled it GRC, being called the father of GRC from that perspective, and wrote the first two Forrester GRC waves comparing solutions. I've been 18 years as an independent, competing against Gartner, Forrester, Chartis, Verdantix, G2, and others. But today, let's set the context first. We'll talk a lot about value, and I have a whole blog I just published on this that's got a lot of attention and newsletter. But let's start with setting the context for GRC so we know what we're talking about in order to be able to measure value. So setting that context, first off, risk is our business. Going to season 2, episode 20 of the original series of Star Trek. Captain Kirk there has this executive committee meeting with Spock and Bones and Scotty, and they're making a decision. Do we go on this mission? And Captain Kirk gets up and says, risk is our business. That's what this starship is all about. That's why we're aboard her. Every business is a starship of risk. And for those that are interested, I have a whole podcast that started called Risk is Our Business with a little Star Trek theme to it. But, risk is our business. Every business is like a starship of risk. The business that is not taking risk is the business that is out of business. Are we taking the right risks? Are we managing risks well within the organization? How do we leverage risk? Do we know our exposure to our objectives? These are all critical themes. Thomas Aquinas, from the 13th century medieval philosopher, stated, if the highest aim of the captain was a preservation of the ship, he would leave it in port forever. I'll say that again. If the highest aim of the captain was the preservation of the ship, he would leave it in port forever. But guess what? That's not what ships are built for. They're built to go out in the ocean waters and do commerce and trade and take those risks. Just like whether it's a starship with Star Trek or like, a medieval ship in the 13th century, they're designed to take risks, and your business is designed to take risks. Are you taking the right risks? The challenge we face is that the modern business, the modern organization, is a chaotic environment. It's navigating chaos. We got changing laws and regulations. Global financial services firms are dealing with 250 regulatory change events every business day coming from 1,300 regulators around the world. If you look at INHISA's statistics for environmental health and safety and ESG regulations, there's 300 regulatory changes every business day. There's a lot of legal and regulatory change. It could be a new law or regulation, change law or regulation, enforcement action, notice of proposed rulemaking. But then you have the geopolitical risks and all the other risks in the external environment. And that's a challenge. You've got the changing uncertainty around commodities and foreign exchange rates and currency fluctuations and, climate risks and disruptions to supply chains and businesses, to ransomware attacks on suppliers and extended enterprise. And all these are critical things that impact your business. I was scouring the city of Milwaukee 2 years ago looking for jelly beans. I couldn't find the jelly bean candy. I look it up and find out that the war in Ukraine impacts the wheat production that goes into that produces the starch to make jelly beans, causing a jelly bean shortage in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the United States. These geopolitical risks disrupt our business. In one of my risk and resilience by design workshops, I had a firm there that talked about how, with the war in Ukraine, they were actually, they had supply chain, not supply, service provider and outsourcing relationships into Russia. And with the war in Ukraine, they were hacked into and their systems were held at ransom until they broke ties with these service providers in Russia. This is significant. It's an interconnected risk environment. But not only are all the risks changing and all the regulations changing, but the business itself is changing. New employees come in. Are they trained on the policies? Are they reminded of the policies? They know their accountability and responsibilities. They move roles, and you have inherited rights issues and things with access to systems, and you've got changing technology and processes and patches that need to be applied. And then the modern organization is not defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. It's the extended web of third-party relationships, the vendors, suppliers, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, and more. And we have to keep all this stuff in sync. And you can devote a ton of subject matter expertise and know everything about like that law or regulation that changed. But if that process doesn't have that control in it because of that change, or that employee wasn't aware of that policy, you're not compliant. It's this interconnected risk environment. The physicist Fritjof Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they are interconnected and interdependent. They cannot be managed in isolation. He's talking about biological ecosystems, but he might as well have been talking about risk in your business today. I often use the story and illustration of the Titanic to illustrate this. Captain E.J. Smith of the Titanic stated, I've never have been wrecked. I've never been in a wreck. I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. There you have the CEO of the ship, the captain, saying, nothing can happen to it. It's unsinkable. The front page of the newspaper said it was unsinkable. So not just the captain, the CEO, but the press, the public. There you have your first risk, overconfidence. And then you had to push to get across the Atlantic quickly to show its speed and power of the day. How often are we pushing the business faster than we can keep up with the risk environment? External risks. No organization here operates in a bubble. We're impacted by the external world. Those risks impact our business. The Titanic had that. In 1912, the tidal moon poles of January, February, March 1912 were a stronger nature, bringing more hazards of icebergs into the shipping lanes. The health and safety risks. There wasn't a proper number of life preservers and lifeboats for the number of passengers on board. They tell us that the size of the rudder and propeller were undersized from the massive size of the ship, so it was not as navigable in the waters as it should have been. That's like not having the right capital reserves in place for the amount of risk the business is taking on. It left port with a boiler fire out of control. There was actually a fire on board the ship, an uncontrolled fire that was heating up the sides of the ship when it left port. That's like us having some incident and we're sort of ignoring it and not paying attention to it. Now, supply chain issues. The Titanic had the iron ore that was used in the rivets was of a brittle inferior quality. So going into the extended enterprise and supply chain risks. Oversight functions like those on the phone, second and third line functions. The Titanic had that. They're getting telegraphs from the ship saying warnings, icebergs in the area. One of the responses back from the Titanic was, shut up, we're tired of hearing about it. Can you imagine that? EU Dora, shut up, we're tired of hearing about it, whatever it might be. But then the Titanic had technology, like our host SureCloud, to be able to scan the ocean for risks and hazards like icebergs. Back in 1912, GRC technology was called binoculars. The crew member that had the key to the cabinet where the binoculars was kept was assigned duty to another ship force at sail and took the keys with them. Lucky for that crew member, unlucky for the Titanic. How often do we have something like SureCloud installed and we're only using it for this little thing and not really for its full capability? And then the Titanic was headed towards the iceberg. If it would have hit it dead on, only 2 compartments would have flooded. It was designed to stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded. It tried to navigate in the waters. The propeller and rudder were undersized to the size of the ship, so it was not as navigable. It brushed up against the iceberg. The boiler fire combined with the weak iron ore in the rivets, the seams of the ship ripped open. 6 compartments flooded. It sank, but it sank slowly. There's time to get off the ship, but there wasn't a proper amount of health and safety equipment. It was a multifaceted, interconnected risk environment. But who knows? Maybe all these risks were somewhat known and people in their little silos thought, not that big of a deal. But when you look at that aggregate risk exposure and what happened to the Titanic, it's a very significant deal. And organizations need better visibility across all their risks. But instead, what we have in a lot of organizations is the GRC Mystery House. This is patterned after the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. This is a sprawling mansion that was built in the 1800s. It cost $5.5 million US to build then. So you calculate inflation, it's a very expensive house today. It took 38 years to build, had 147 different builders, but had no design, no blueprint, no architect. At the end of the day, it's got doors that open to walls or 20-foot drops, staircases that go to nowhere, skylights that are in floors instead of ceilings. This is a lot of risk programs, GRC programs in organizations today, that over the last 38 years, they've had 147 different builders of their little siloed view without any design or blueprint for the broader perspective of risk in the organization. Like one firm in the UK that I'm interacting with, they've interviewed 30 different departments and have found 10 different GRC risk platforms, and as well as tens of thousands of documents, spreadsheets, and emails, because there's all these little silos that have gone about different ways, creating all these redundancies, gaps, overlaps, without any perspective across risk in the business. Now, adding to that, we have the challenge that too many GRC programs, whether it's risk or compliance, it's like driving a car down the road, and you're not looking at the road ahead of you, You're looking at what's happened in the past behind you. It's like we're not looking out the window. We're looking at the rearview mirror the whole time. And think about it. ISO 31000 states that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So where should your eyes be? On the road ahead of you. The rearview mirror is an important safety device. We need to be able to glance at it, as well as the dashboard. But a good risk program, our eyes are going to be on the road ahead of us. But so many of these GRC and risk programs out there, by the time we collect all this information and process it, it's about the past. It's looking behind us and not in front of us. One firm is spending 200 hours to build a risk report for the board of directors every year. 200 hours because it was trapped in siloed systems and a lot of documents, spreadsheets, and emails before they got this aggregated risk report. To find out the last year they did it that way, that they had risk issues that started months ago that were out of control now. That's driving your business, your car, looking at the rearview mirror, not the road ahead of you. Because by the time you actually get the risk information, it's already an incident. It's an issue. It's being reactive to risk and not proactive. That's a big challenge and issue in organizations. One mid-sized bank, I worked on their RFP. They found out that when it came to risk and internal control, compliance, security, 80% of their staff time is actually spent managing and chasing documents, spreadsheets, and emails, and not managing risk and compliance. Very inefficient. So I painted the horror story on all the bad and the ugly. Now let's go to the good. Now, the official definition of GRC.
I'm really
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, Michael. Your slides aren't showing. I've just been told. Apologies for that.
Oh, they're not?
See, you're so good at delivering this. It works without the slides.
Do you see them now?
Yeah, you can see them now.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened. We had them shared. So if you hadn't seen them, there's my slides there. Setting the GRC context, my Captain Kirk quote, navigating chaos, the GRC mystery house, driving with the rearview mirror. So we'll catch up there. So the official definition of GRC found in the OSEC GRC capability model is that GRC is a capability that enables an organization to what? Reliably achieve objectives. That's the G in GRC. That's where it starts, is the objectives. Then we address uncertainty. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. The objective sets the context, and we act with integrity. But it starts with setting the objectives and performing against those objectives. And that sets the context. Now we can have financial, operational, strategic, ethical, legal, regulatory objectives. We can have objectives at the entity level, division, department, process, project, asset level objectives like employee or customer information. We have privacy concerns around there. We can even have relationship objectives. That supplier, that outsourcer, we just didn't randomly choose to work with somebody. There's a purpose for that relationship. What are the objectives? The first and fundamental piece of GRC is establishing the objectives. What's the context here? And then we need to address uncertainty, which is a challenge in a global environment. There's so much going on around us. And how do we address this? And how do we see this interconnected view of risk across, not just interconnected view of risk, but also controls. If we have an enterprise view of risk, it really necessitates we also have an enterprise view of controls as well. And how do we get this visibility into this across the organization and across the business around these risks impacting the business? But then we have to act with integrity too. We have what we would call mandatory boundaries, which are like laws and regulations or even contractual commitments, as well as voluntary boundaries. What's our stake in the ground on our commitment to the environment and social communities and the governance of the organization and ESG and sustainability programs? What is our code of conduct stage? What are our ethics and values? So we have mandatory and voluntary boundaries that are set in the organization, and we have to make sure that we act with integrity, that as we drive the organization towards its objectives, we stay within our boundaries. And a little case in point here, this is why we don't have one mammoth GRC department. We have different departments working together collectively on this because there's proper checks and balances and segregation of duties. Risk management, for example, is neutral. I can do a risk assessment that says breaking that law, we can make a lot of money and most likely get away with it. The compliance is what sets the boundaries and say, no, you don't step across that line, even if we can make a lot of money and get away with it. And so these provide proper checks and balances to the organization as well. So here's some important points. We all do GRC, whether you call it GRC, ERM, ORM, IRM, ABC, XYZ, don't even have an acronym for it. I doubt anybody watching this webinar is going to say, we don't govern the organization. It sort of wanders around by itself out there, and we don't set objectives and direct and steer the organization. Risk, we're completely ignorant of it, and compliance, it's like, who cares? No, every organization has some approach to governance, risk management, and compliance. Whether you call it GRC or something else, the question is, how mature is it? How mature is your strategy in your processes and approach? The other thing I'll say is, you do not buy GRC. Governance, risk, and compliance is culture, processes, behavior, accountability structures. You can't buy that. Now, technology is there to enable GRC, but I get frustrated. Like this large insurance company called me up one day and said, we just bought GRC. Now come and tell us how to do GRC. It's like, what were you doing before? Yeah, that's sort of like putting the cart before the horse. What wasn't working? Why did you even buy technology? What was the purpose for this? You don't go out and just buy GRC. You do GRC, and technology enables that. And we're all using technology for GRC. Whether using stone tablets and chisels, that's technology. If you're back in the Stone Age, if you're using documents or even pen and paper, that's technology. Documents, spreadsheets, emails, that's technology. SureCloud, now that's much better technology in this context. But, we're all using technology. Are we using technology that actually delivers value, and how can we get more value? But to bring this to conclusion on the setting the context here, what we're aiming, aiming for is GRC orchestration. We need that conductor because there's a lot of departments of risk and compliance control, and then there's the business itself. When you go to a symphony, you've got the violins and the violas, the cellos, the bass, the woodwinds, the brass, the percussion, and even there's different parts within them. Like in the violins, you might have different sections, and you have the concert master violinist. It's really complex, a symphony, because there's all these different pieces, and the conductor's got to be able to see across all these. And that's what we need in business today, is that conductor of risk, to be able to see across all these different departments, from compliance and legal and IT security and privacy and ESG and all these different elements, and get them to work together and coordinate together. So now let's move to measuring the value of GRC technology. I'm excited for this. I hope you are too. There's a lot of interesting themes to go into here as we discuss this. And interact on this. A very important topic. But, measuring the value of GRC technology in your technology investment. A lot of us, we've focused on the ROI pieces of this, that return on investment. And that's important. But my argument is the real value of GRC technology, like our host SureCloud, is so much more than that. So much more than that. But we failed to build that strong business case and be able to measure that, and we need to address that. So in that context, we need to innovate and re-architect how we're using GRC technology. This quote has been attributed to both E.F. Schumacher and Einstein. So I don't know who originally sent it, but any intelligent fool can make things bigger, more complex, and more violent. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. And so how do we leverage technology? How's technology changing? And how do we build that business case and value? This requires rethinking how we build those business cases and approach. Let me tell you a story. It was just last week, I was in London. Actually, I was 3 weeks in Europe, and the last week was in London. I'm back in the UK, June 9th through 26th. Busy time. But in a London evening last week in Mayfair, sitting down at one of my favorite Indian restaurants, Jamavar in Mayfair, I caught up to dinner with my friend Stefan, who's the head of risk and governance at Co-op in the UK, a large retail organization. And so, I really respect Stefan. He's a very sharp risk thinker. And so we decided to catch up, decompress, compare notes on what we're seeing in the world of governance, risk management, and compliance. Midway through our conversations, before our starters arrive, he glances at his phone and raises an eyebrow. Right? And Stefan basically says, "Another one." Stefan's a really interesting character. He's great to work with and interact with, but he's got his opinions. He'll state them. A vendor had just messaged him directly promoting their GRC platform. And the message read, like so many do, that with all these bold efficiency complaints, you can save 75% in time on risk assessments and reporting. You can cut your audit prep time in half. Now, Stefan smiles, unimpressed. He said, "Nobody bought a GRC tool because it makes the risk guy's job easier. It's not a benefit that will make people buy," he responds. "Show me how this reduces risk to my corporate objectives. That is what interests me." That one sentence really struck me. It was a masterclass in clarity, an executive, not seduced by buzzwords or dashboards, but, the focus is on outcomes. What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And sometimes, this just reminds us of just how off track GRC technology conversations get. The truth is, nobody really buys a GRC tool just to make the risk guys or compliance guys' job easier. GRC is not about efficiency for its own sake. Efficiency is important. We're going to get to that. We're going to talk about that. But it's also about enabling the organization to reliably achieve its objectives, navigate uncertainty, and protect its integrity. Time savings is important. It's useful. But if those time savings do not translate into improved and better decisions, reduced risk exposure, and stronger organizational performance, then the platform may be automating the wrong things faster and perpetuating poor risk management. So that's what we need to have perspective on. And we need to be able to get better visibility into current and future GRC contexts. If we've been following me so far in this webinar, GRC is not a piece of software. It's a capability, as I described in the OSI GRC capability model. It's an integrated set of practices across the enterprise that support governance and setting and achieving objectives, the risk of management in addressing uncertainty to objectives, and compliance acting with integrity as we pursue objectives. It includes strategy and structure, culture and behavior, policies and processes, roles, responsibilities. Technology plays a role, but it is an enabling role, not GRC itself. And so, a well-implemented GRC technology solution, like our host SureCloud, can be transformative, but it does so when it supports the broader capability, and that capability must deliver value in more than one dimensions. And so we need to be able to see the road ahead of us and deliver on that value and get visibility into our current state, as well as the future contexts and scenarios that the organization's going towards. The other aspect, of outcomes and value is delivering digital trust. The most popular blog I ever wrote in my career, and I've been writing blogs for 25 years, but the most popular blog was last September. And you can go out on my website and read it, but it got over 100,000 views on LinkedIn. And there's some people that didn't like it. They didn't disagree with my argument, but they didn't like the title. But I said, "The CISO is dead, a eulogy and a resurrection." And people want to hang on to their chief information security officer role. And I understand that. I started my career in the 1990s in the information security part of GRC. I appreciate that. But my whole point is that what we're dealing with today is so much broader than traditional information security with hackers, viruses, and worms. 2 months before that blog was the CrowdStrike incident. And in that context, that wasn't a cyber, that wasn't a hack or a ransomware or anything like that. But it was a significant digital resilience issue. And we're seeing these repeat themselves over and over again. So to me, information security doesn't define this anymore. It's broader. It's digital risk and resilience aimed at delivering digital trust. And I bring this up as one aspect of GRC because the organization no matter what industry or size of organization, is so reliant on technology in every operations and processes that information security, often buried in the bowels of IT, doesn't work anymore. We need digital risk and resilience that expands the business and business areas. And we also have to leverage AI in this context as well. And that's important too. But also, how do we leverage AI, but how do we govern AI in the business? Just some broader context slides there. But now let's talk about GRC value. My whole point here is that it's more than just ROI. That we need to move beyond that. Include it still. I'm not saying it's going away. That's an important thing to consider. But so in this context, I have developed what I call the 4 dimensions of GRC value framework: efficiency, effectiveness, resilience, and agility. Efficiency, effectiveness, resilience, and agility. So let's start with the foundation. And that's what I've been picking on. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying we need to build more than that. But that's efficiency. Efficiency is traditional ROI, return on investment, time saved, money saved. Efficiency is the most commonly touted benefit in GRC solution pitches. And for good reason. Organizations waste enormous amounts of time managing risk controls and compliance through fragmented, manual, spreadsheet, and email-driven processes, or in silos of non-integrated solutions and technology that go in different directions. These inefficiencies are absolutely costly to the organization, not only in terms of personnel hours, but in opportunity costs and risk of error. We need to move beyond that and look at the broader perspective that includes efficiency, but goes more. Consider, for example, a global consumer goods company that had 5 separate teams managing overlapping third-party risk processes in different areas of the business. Each team had its own intake forms, risk assessment templates, and reporting structure. The result was a lot of redundancy, inconsistent decisions, and no centralized view of supplier risk exposure. After deploying a GRC approach to third-party risk to unify and automate these processes, they reduce administrative effort by approximately 80%. That traditional ROI, but it took us, let's say 1,000 hours to do this, 80% reduction now takes us 200 hours to do this. They eliminated 80% of that duplication and redundancy. So ROI is important, but here's the key. Those time savings were not the business case. They were the enabler. The real value came in improved decision-making and better vendor oversight, not faster form completion. So efficiency is nice. We like ROI. It's a good thing, but there's much more to GRC value. Efficiency matters, but it's only the first step of the 4 that I'm going to. To put this in perspective, some GRC efficiency can help us reduce friction, manual effort, and redundancies across GRC processes. So efficiency gains, like with a solution like SureCloud, helps us provide automation of workflow and tasks, eliminates duplication and redundant processes and activities, provides for efficiency in reporting with a single record of truth. It has that single data entry flows into multiple reporting outputs for regulators, boards, operational risk owners, and so forth, and can even automate control testing and evidence collection. These are all great efficiency gains. Like that firm that had 200 hours every year to build a risk report, that now takes them probably, less than an hour, because everything's in one place. And that other, that bank they mentioned that had 80% of their staff time chasing documents, spreadsheets, and emails, not managing risk and controls, they flipped that around, where only 20% is then that manual reconciliation, 80% is actually improving risk and compliance. Those are all really good efficiency gains. But to put this in perspective, efficient GRC is about doing things right, but effective GRC is about doing the right things. So that brings me to the second part in the 4-dimension of value framework. Effectiveness. Effectiveness is about actual measurable risk reduction. And to me, this is absolutely critical. If you're buying a GRC tool like SureCloud, it should have a measurable reduction in risk. We would be wasting our money and time if there's not some type of quantifiable, measurable reduction in risk. Effectiveness is actually reducing actual risk exposure. So this is the dimension that too often gets ignored, but is one of the most critical. Is there a measurable, quantifiable reduction in risk exposure to your organization's objectives and operations? In GRC, effectiveness value means your efforts are actually lowering risk exposure, enabling the organization to reliably achieve objectives amid all the uncertainty. Not just perceived risk, not checkbox risk, but real measurable risk exposure, uncertainty to your strategic, financial, and operational objectives. For example, an organization that had a lot of risk registers and beautifully documented control libraries, yet they still often suffered repeated incidents, regulatory scrutiny, and failed to show risk reduction and enable the business to manage uncertainty to objectives. Why? Because they had no way of linking controls to outcomes or risk scoring to business objectives. Their GRC efforts were comprehensive but not calibrated. They're tracking noise instead of reducing signal. How often is that our processes today, that we're just tracking that noise instead of reducing signal? So we need to contrast with this to another organization, this one in financial services, that focused their GRC program on risk-weighted investment and controls. They used a platform similar to SureCloud, not just to document risks, but to correlate them with control performance, incident frequency, audit findings, and business objectives. This allowed them to identify areas of over-control where compliance to those controls were a burden that could be reduced. It enabled them to justify increased investment in high-risk areas that had weak mitigation, and demonstrate to the board a clear line from GRC activities to business outcomes and objectiveness. Effectiveness here wasn't about how fast they completed assessments. That's the efficiency. It was about the confidence that risks were being managed within tolerance and being able to prove it. So some examples of effectiveness is the ability to improve, improving the ability and then the capability to identify, evaluate, and treat real risk exposure, such as having risk indicators that are linked to business objectives, trigger early warnings when something crosses a threshold, have control effectiveness that's validated through incident correlation, not just testing, dynamic risk scoring that reflects real-time changes in the environment or exposure to risk, having risk appetite thresholds that are tied to escalation rules and board reporting, and ensuring things do not slip through the cracks. So these are all critical. So I talked already that efficient GRC is about doing things right, but effective GRC that we've been exploring is about doing the right things. Now, if you cannot demonstrate that your GRC program is measurably reducing risk to your objectives, then you are not being effective. You're just active, perhaps like a hamster on a wheel, not truly getting anywhere. So we looked at efficiency, we looked at effectiveness. Now let's look at resilience, the ability to anticipate and recover from incidents and disruption. The good GRC implementation is going to help us find issues, exposures, failures when they're still small issues before they become a big issue. There's going to be a way to quantify the resilience of the organization and the lower impact on incidents from having a good GRC strategy. Resilience is containing the impact, not just recording it. So resilience is not just about disaster recovery plans or business continuity documentation. Resilience in GRC means the organization can detect, contain, and recover from disruptions and exposures before they cascade into full-blown crisis. Consider a manufacturer who experienced a major supplier cyber incident that exposed them to scrutiny and lost production time. Post-incident analysis revealed that the risk was known but siloed. IT had flagged it as a concern, but procurement and compliance were unaware and ignorant of it. No one had centralized visibility or accountability. Following that incident, they implemented a GRC solution with integrated third-party monitoring, real-time alerts, and automated risk escalation pathways. The next time a similar issue emerged with a different vendor, it was flagged, triaged, and mitigated because before causing any operational impact. This is what resilience looks like. Not absence of disruption, but the ability to see it early, contain it quickly, and recover with confidence. And that's where good GRC technology, like our host SureCloud, helps us find those issues early on before they become a bigger issue. So detecting and containing risk events before they escalate into crisis is what that third dimension is about of GRC value. We would need to be able to deliver integrated monitoring that flags critical disruptions before service impacts. Provide cross-functional incident playbooks that streamline coordinated response, near-miss reporting channels that improve learning and future mitigation, Role-based alerts to ensure issues are acted upon quickly by the right teams and risks are linked to upstream and downstream dependencies so we know the context. So resilience is what keeps a compliance issue from becoming a scandal, a system failure from becoming a shutdown, think CrowdStrike, a risk exposure from becoming a crisis. So we've looked at, if you're following me, efficiency, effectiveness, resilience. Now the fourth one, my favorite one, agility. I've already mentioned that, good GRC is not about looking in the rearview mirror the whole time. It's important. It's about looking at the road ahead of us. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Where's the car, the business that is, headed? What are the obstacles that can happen and pop up in our road, in our pathway? I once wrote one of my first blogs when I left Forrester, 18 years ago, was everything I need to know about risk management I learned in driver's education. And so in driver's ed back in, the 80s in high school, we had the IPTE, the interpret, predict, decide, execute, interpret what's going on around me, predict what's going to happen, the analysis, and decide and execute, and that's how you drive a car. That's how you drive a business. Where's the business headed? What are those objectives? What are the obstacles that can come up in the road as the business drives there? And how do we navigate that road of uncertainty in the business? Agility. This is the often overlooked value of GRC in helping organizations not just survive, but thrive through change. This is what the greatest value of GRC is if an organization is mature enough to achieve it and has the vision to achieve it. The word agility is extremely important because it enables us to actually leverage risk to value of the organization. Because it helps us to navigate that risk. The world doesn't wait for risk teams to catch up. We have new regulations, emerging technologies, geopolitical shifts, environmental crises and events. These all create an environment where yesterday's risks and controls are insufficient for today's realities. The question before you, can your GRC program, again, if you call it GRC, ERM, ORM, whatever you call it, can your program keep up? Are you navigating the road ahead of the organization, or are you driving fixated on that rearview mirror? Consider a digital services company undergoing rapid expansion into Southeast Asia and the Middle East. It found itself navigating a complex mix of regulatory expectations because there's a lot of different regulators there. There's not the consistency you see like in Europe, cultural norms, and there's an emerging risks, geopolitical, operational, financial. As they pursued these strategic objectives, which they tied to their regional market growth strategy, leadership quickly recognized that their ability to reliably achieve objectives was threatened by fragmented risk management practices. Within a unified GRC framework, it was difficult to anticipate and adapt to these different regulatory jurisdictional differences or maintain consistent oversight. By implementing GRC technology, of course, supporting a broader business strategy on GRC, they gained forward-looking visibility into regulations, risk exposures, and operational dependencies across these regions. This allowed the organization to proactively chart a course, scaling risk management practices in parallel with their expansion, ensuring that growth was not only fast, but sustainable and governed with integrity and risk management. Agility meant that they could enter new markets with confidence, see the road ahead of them. That is the objective, and the obstacles appearing in the way of achieving those objectives in their growth strategy without slowing down the business. Some examples of agility. I'm sorry, it says resilience here. I should have changed that. It should say GRC agility. Is adapting GRC processes to support evolving strategy, objectives, and risks. Where we have risk libraries that are easily updated to reflect changing objectives and emerging threats. We deliver scenario modeling that evaluates risks to strategic pivots and objectives. Provide those GRC dashboards within our solutions like SureCloud to shift focus based on changing KPIs and objectives. Provide expansion into new markets, triggers realignment of risk and compliance workflows, and deliver rapid deployment of new regulatory requirements without re-architecting. GRC should not be the handbrake. The ultimate value of GRC is that it should be the navigation system helping the business steer safely through uncertainty towards its objectives. So we've looked at my 4 dimensions of GRC value framework, where efficiency saves time and money, effectiveness reduces actual risk, Resilience detects and contains issues, and agility provides that navigation of uncertainty ahead. Efficiency, if you have been following me, efficiency is part of the GRC value, that traditional ROI, but it's only part of the story. Done right, the value of efficiency or ROI is only a small fragment of the value of GRC when done correctly in the right context of the organization's objectives. The strongest business cases I see are the ones that anchor GRC in strategic outcomes, such as reduced risk exposure to what matters most in the context of the business and its objectives, informed investment in the right controls to reliably achieve those objectives, fewer incidents with faster response and recovery that could expose objectives, and smarter navigation through a changing world out there in the business as we strive to achieve objectives. So we need to provide the context. We need to lead with GRC impact, not with interfaces and workflows. ROI is important, but we need to make sure we're also demonstrating the quantifiable value of effectiveness, that risk reduction, that value of informed investment, and being able to also deliver on resilience and be able to contain issues and have fewer incidents and navigate the business with that agility. So stop selling your GRC program and business case for GRC as time savings. Now, that's a piece of it. I'm saying don't have it, but start showing how it enables the business to achieve objectives, adapt to change and uncertainty, and act with integrity in an uncertain world. So with that, I'd like to say risk is our business. You can follow my podcasts out there. There's 3 episodes and many more coming. So as Captain Kirk said, risk is our business. That's what the Starship is all about. And risk is your business as well. Besides my podcast, I have my analyst hat with GRC 2020 Research, where I compare and contrast all the different GRC technologies out there in the market, but also help with GRC strategy and process. And I have the GRC Report, which is the global news website in governance, risk, and compliance news. So with this, I'm going to turn this back for this last 10 minutes to Nick to navigate us through what type of questions we might have.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. Look, I really always enjoy your presentations because they're all story-based, and a good story brings everything to life. So thank you for that really interesting content. Look, I've got something that was an observation in terms of our experience. So I completely agree with what you've been through. I think where lots of struggles come from prospects in our world or in our experience has been the efficiency side of things is definitely, as you say, a small part and definitely a benefit. That's the easiest one to quantify. You then got the effectiveness and again, risk reduction. And I think a lot of the organizations that we work with have really struggled to then quantify what that really means in terms of monetary value. Larger organizations that we've had exposure to will look at things like cyber risk quantification to then put dollar amounts on those types of risk reduction programs. We've also then looked at things like increasing in confidence. So from a baseline degree of confidence to a new degree of confidence around compliance against regulatory requirements, and then the associated risk of a fine. We can take a proportion of that based on the increase in confidence to say, well, this is the kind of value that a risk reduction or risk of non-compliance will then give you. And that can then be added to the efficiency gain side of things. And the numbers are very different in scale. You clearly can't take all of the increase in confidence of managing regulations. You can't take the whole of that and apply that just to GRC, but you can take a proportion of it. And those numbers are still quite big when you look at adding those up relative to the efficiency side of things. I guess my question is, have you seen any other ways other than CRQ of being able to put a monetary value on those effectiveness measures in terms of risk reduction?
Well, first off, I'll state that a lot of times people make mistakes in measuring risk reduction because they don't even know the full impact. So when you mentioned like fines and things like that, fines are just one part of an incident. I mean, you take like the Siemens FCPA case as one example. They were fined 800 million US dollars for the FCPA violation. And that's one aspect. And that wasn't even counting the fines from the other regulators, like on the German side and others. But they also had another 800 million in investigation costs. And then they have the cost for ongoing monitoring for a decade and reporting back to the government, which adds several $100,000 to it. So I mean, the total impact of, my estimate of like the FCPA case just from the US side of Siemens was an $800 million fine, but had about over a $2 billion impact. And when you add up all the different costs.
Yep.
And so a lot of times we're missing elements because we just focus on fines and things like that. And there's, we also have to take into account, opportunity cost and a lot of different aspects there. But to me, there's the aspect of the risk reduction and being able to reduce risk exposure and how do we quantify that? And sometimes it's a little combination of both art and science because we've got to have good information and take in information and create hypothetical scenarios that, if we do this, we're going to avoid this because if we actually avoid it, it's not going to come to reality. But so we have to create those hypothetical scenarios, and it's got to be modeled after good information on what does this cost other organizations. But that's one side. But what's the value of enabling risk management to make better business decisions? And how do we quantify that? That's a little harder, but that gets into a huge value of GRC. For example, there's a great article from 2007 called Goldman Sachs Behind the Brass Plate. And they actually compared Goldman Sachs to Lehman Brothers. And Goldman Sachs was noted in the article for being very aggressive in taking risk. They took on a lot of risk. But they made themselves a lot of money because they managed that risk well. They had a culture where if you're making a significant risk, you had to get other people involved and get other people's perspectives. And risk was a team decision to take, where Lehman Brothers was known to be conservative in taking risk and didn't take on the level of risk that Goldman Sachs did. That's 2007. Next year, 2008, the financial crisis. Who exists today? I mean, the risk taker did. So how do you measure that value? That good risk management and even taking risks can help us achieve great value to the organization. That's something to consider, but it's sometimes harder to quantify.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with you. We look at revenue protection, revenue enablement as well, and those sides of things. So, got another question here. Actually, there's two that are related to AI, so I'll pick that they kind of overlap with each other. So, thanks, Michael. Really interesting stuff. How do you think the industry will adapt to AI governance, such as ISO 41001 or the EU AI Act? Is it just a new domain for compliance, or is it a new challenge completely?
Gosh, is it a new domain for compliance or is it a new challenge completely? Can I say both? um, on the EU, it's the EU AI Act and the new ISO standard in the US. But even in Europe, I get a lot of interaction on the NIST AI governance framework. It sort of depends on what industry you're coming from, because within financial services, we've had model risk management for a long time, being able to define our models, govern the models and their use, validate those models, provide assurance on it. And a lot of model risk management that we see in financial services is just extended for AI. Now, there's nuances. You can't just take your model risk management program in a bank and it works perfectly for AI, because like with the EU AI Act, there's use cases. And does this involve this scenario with this type of information? And does it involve this scenario with this type of information? Because that's going to adjust your risk scoring to what you have to do. But there's a lot of fundamental infrastructure for model risk management within banks that does lend well to AI governance. But a lot of other industries don't have that as well. So for some, it's completely new. But in financial services, it's, to me, tweaking some of the stuff we already have and adding to it.
Absolutely. There's a good one here. Can resilience be quantified, or is it just a qualitative concept in GRC programs?
I feel it can be quantified. Again, you're dealing with scenarios and hypotheticals. So sometimes it's like, if we avoid an incident, how do we measure that, what it could have been? Because it never happened. So in some areas, it's scenarios and hypotheticals. Other times, it's much easier to quantify because our main competitor was brought to their knees because of this, and it cost them this. Because of our approach, we had minimal impact. And you can contrast that, for example. I feel everything can be quantified, but it is, again, building those models. And it's about building the scenarios. And those scenarios have to be realistic and not like pie in the sky and just anything. You've got to document your inputs and your assumptions and everything that going into it on how this operates and works.
Yeah, absolutely. And things that we've seen with our customer base in terms of moving from recovery time objectives and points in the world of resilience, there's things like mean time to detect and mean time to respond. So there are actual metrics that you can measure at the programmatic level as well, which we support within our solutions. Another one on AI, actually, which is not a surprise. How do GRC leaders ensure agility with AI whilst staying secure?
Properly governing AI, implementing controls around AI, and the overall, what I call AI GRC, the AI governance structures. I have a whole paper on AI GRC, the governance, risk management, and compliance of AI itself. But, to deliver that agility, to let the organization leverage AI, it needs to properly be governed, and the models need to be approved, tested, validated in that context. So to me, the proper AI GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance of AI, helps us enable that agility so that we can ensure that AI can be used and used effectively, but in a way that is safe and mitigates the uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. The last one we'll have a bit of time for quickly, I think, is just around creative ways that GRC teams can demonstrate value to the board level or executive leadership. I think it comes back to something you've done throughout this whole presentation is around storytelling, but I'll let you answer that one as well.
Yeah, I mean, storytelling is where it really comes into play, but to me, it also brings in left brain and right brain risk management. I'm much more of a right brain person than a left brain. I love risk quantification. I'm talking about quantifying stuff. My father was an accountant. My brother is an accountant. They love math. I was decent at math, but I love stories and analogies. And so when it comes to the executives and board, it's good to quantify things, but you also have to put it in context. Here's the story. For example, this one large firm out of the Middle East that I've worked with, and interacted with, they do Monte Carlo analysis and bow tie risk analysis for their risks. And they went to the board of directors and said, and this is going back to, I think it was 2021. And they said, the economists, so this is about the Egyptian currency. The economists were predicting the Egyptian currency was going to tank in 12 months. Based on their Monte Carlo simulations tied to their bow tie risk analysis, which is a visual that we don't have time for me to get all into today. They use their bow tie as the key risk indicators, and things started to light up on it. They go to their board and say, we think the Egyptian currency is going to go down in 3 months, not 12 months. They reacted, the board did, and they saved themselves a ton of money. And the board came back and said, we like those bow ties. The Monte Carlo and the risk quantification, that was nice, but that bow tie told a story. Can you give us bow ties and other risk? And they did one for cyber risk. And the board said, we actually understand it now because you lay it all out visually. We actually understand what you mean by that potential ransomware, that cyber attack. Here's the money to address this risk, by the way, because that visual of the bow tie that was supported by the risk quantification, the Monte Carlo analysis, told that story and provided context that the board could actually get their heads around, which is important.
Perfect. Sadly, we're out of time. So just really quickly to say thank you very much, Michael. Interesting content as ever, very thought-provoking. For everyone else, thank you for joining. If you'd like to learn more about how SureCloud can help underpin and then embed your GRC capability in your organization, then please feel free to reach out. Nick Rafferty at SureCloud.com or nick.rafferty at SureCloud.com, or just visit our website where there's some great content. But thanks very much for joining us and have a great day. Thank you.
Your business assured.